Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Our special guest today is David Spratt. And David Spratt is the research director for Breakthrough National Center for Climate Restoration and co-author of What Lies Beneath: The Understatement of Existential Climate Risk and Climate Code Red, the Case for Emergency Climate Action.
Oh, good. Okay. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Greetings, David. Hi.
Excellent. Hi, Steve. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, ditto. Yeah. Yeah, I read your materials, of course. So whereabouts are you based?
Melbourne.
Lucky you, rather than bloody Sydney at the moment.
Yes. Is that where you are?
No, I'm in worse. I'm in Thailand.
Oh, yes, that's right. I knew you weren't in Australia, but that's not great at the moment.
Well, it wasn't. It was fabulous last year, better than Australia. But I guess just like bloody Gladys has done, they dropped the ball on COVID. Went for a week lockdown, and that week lockdown started in March. It's been slowly getting stricter, and the numbers have been not slowly rising. And now they've gone from 30 in March to 20,000 cases a day as of today.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
are you vaccinated?
Yes, and twice, but unusually, the first one I had back in March of 2020.
Right. That
was an experimental vaccine from one of my supporters on Patreon. He's a vaccine researcher. So that's I don't know how much left of that one. It was a DNA vaccine, actually, not even RNA. More advanced again. And then I had my first shot of AZ. I had two weeks ago. So I'm waiting for the. Yeah. How about yourself?
Oh, I've had my 2 AZ. So and I'm in Melbourne, where the government knows what it's doing.
Yeah, Daniel, are you aware of that? Being state-based, we know the nuances of Australia very well. And there's one state government is run by the Conservatives over here. They call themselves Liberal. You guys would call them Republican. And they've said, oh, no, we're going to do it the sensible way. We're going to not damage the economy too much. Well, the virus, so that was a great idea. And cases in New South Wales went from one escape case, which was, again, maladministration. So they had a chauffeur driving people, driving air crews to a special, who wasn't required to wear a mask. So he picked it up and then passed it around to the Delta variant, and they continue pussyfooting their way towards what Victoria had did. Then one of the cases got into Victoria. I think it's a removalist, didn't it?
Yes.
And Dan Andrews, there's the Labor Party, you'd call him Democrat, down there, said, right, sharp, hard lockdown, 7 days. Was it 5 days or 7 days?
Well, it was 5 and it turned into 12. But in 12 days, we knocked it off, and the states had a 00 again today. No cases, after having, maybe 20 a day. So it requires really strict measures, but it does actually work. If you lock down really early, really hard, and you can still track and trace and just stop everybody moving, you can get to the bottom of it. But unless you act really early, it's almost impossible. I mean, it's interesting that there's not too much economic damage question. I mean, it's an eerie parallel with climate. Don't act too hard because it'll be economically damaging, but not acting makes it economically impossible.
Well, David,
that's a beautiful quote.
Yeah, hold on just a minute. That sounds like some good stuff that we really, really want to get into. So Steve brought up the question to kind of, to lob the ball over to me, and let me see if I can frame it in this particular way. And I want to frame it with social science. Okay, so in social science studies, the United States ends up being the quintessential individualistic society. And I think so whatever point I'm about to make, I think is exaggerated in the US dichotomy between the Republican and the Democrats. And so in that dichotomy, there's a real strong push from very smart people that say we don't want to have our rights infringed on. right? We don't want to have a liberal government tell us, right, our population what we have to do in terms of when to wear a mask and when not to wear a mask. And I think this is very dangerous because I fall on the side of science, and I'll bring up the tail end of last episode, where we had a very smart individual that throughout the majority of the recording, we had, very lucid conversations about the economics in Steve's book. And yet, as soon as we brought up a politically charged topic of climate change, it completely fell apart. And I have to applaud you, Steve, for very succinctly, bringing that argument into focus again. I found that I was almost caught flat-footed, as I do in many cases with people that want to spin the narrative of denial. And I'm almost sympathetic to a point to say, hey, you know what, guys, I'm fine to listen to your point, but I increasingly just don't want to. I'm just not that kind of person to interrupt and cut them off. And
I am these days.
That's what I'm saying. I almost, it's almost like I'm missing the skills to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the science trumps everything. And what we have is people pushing political ideology they think is, how describes a perfect society. Well, it does. Describes a perfect society that is independent of the environment in which it's placed. There is no such thing. So what you get is people saying, I don't want to be told what to do. I said, that's good. Well, this disease will kill you all then. That's great.
I think what people often don't understand, that the corollary of rights is that with rights come
responsibilities.
Responsibilities.
Yeah, exactly.
And your responsibility is not to kill others by your behaviour, amongst other things. So we've had, people chanting freedom when there are strict lockdowns in rallies, which are technically illegal under the state of emergency, which they've had, who have no sense of responsibility that their actions might actually be killing people by spreading the virus. So I think it's that trade-off that people love rights but don't like responsibilities. Or, in terms of the role of the state, the role of the state is to protect the people. This is in the foundation of your constitution. And the state in protecting people sometimes has to use repressive measures. And if you don't want those repressive measures, then don't have a state at all, and you can have chaos and gangs marauding each other. But you can't have one without the other.
And that's that attitude is much. Australia's suffered a lot of sucking in a lot of American nonsense over the last 20 or 30 years. But that's a tradition of regarding rights going with responsibilities is something which is more common in the Anglo than in the American polity. And when you see back in both in Australia and New Zealand, even more so, Australia was founded as a convict country, and therefore you didn't have many rights and you had plenty of responsibilities. We've pushed the balance back a bit, and now would be, I think, have more effective rights than Americans do, but we don't have the right to bear arms because that comes with a responsibility not to shoot somebody. And the trouble is, you give it to irresponsible people, give them that right, you're going to have massacres, which is what you endemically have there. New Zealand actually was founded as a free colony, though it invaded and attempted to conquer the Maoris. And one of the great things in New Zealand's favour is they failed to conquer the Maoris, and they were forced to use legal means instead to appropriate the country. It's called the Treaty of Waitangi. But that history gives them a much richer sense of the responsibilities, the overall mix of a society, not just this anarchist view of, I can do what I want. That's what's called freedom.
I think the other interesting thing is looking at the Australian experience is that, because we're a remote island state, we can actually separate ourselves out in terms of trade and tourist movement, which you can't in Europe so well. And most of the country has been kept relatively COVID-free for the last 18 months, including by a series of quite strict lockdowns from time to time. But, a clear majority, 2/3 of people really support those lockdowns. They actually support their denial, their short-term denial of some personal rights in order for the society to remain COVID-free.
Well, and guys, here's the thing of the theme of the show, and I think this is the idea, is drawing those proximal and distal correlations between the reality of the way COVID is and the false dichotomies that we're creating in, with this political discourse, which is really a diversion. Whether intentional or not, these are just the outcomes of what we're dealing with. But the show is about the COVID and the climate change correlations. There's nothing causal in that, just purely an observation of kind of what's in store. And I think it's telling of the times that we don't have the wherewithal to do what David had explained is just snuff this out.
And that's what's so frustrating coming at this from a science point of view. By the way, because a lot of the viewers are going to be non-Australians, obviously, to give a context, the total number of cases in Australia at the moment has just cracked 35,000 cases. In total. Now, the population of the country is about 25 million. So if you multiply that by a factor of 15, you've got about 500,000 cases. To compare it to America, which currently has 35 million cases. So you've got 70 times as many cases. The deaths in America, effectively 2/3 of a million deaths. Australia, has Australia cracked 1,000 deaths yet?
Around about that number.
Okay. So, dramatically better performance. And it shows, and just the most recent thing, and this is, it's not the national government. The national government's been an effing disaster in this whole thing. It's the state governments that have done well, and even there you've got a comparative outcome. So Victoria had the worst outcome out of a breach of quarantine from the hotels in which travellers into the country are first allowed. But in the most recent outbreak now, is that began in New South Wales and then got passed to Victoria via people driving from one state to another. So you had the same disease, the Delta variant, in two states, one playing the American game of let's not do too much of a lockdown. Let's put give the economy first priority. Well, how long has it been going on for now?
David? This state is New South Wales, and they have been in lockdown now. I think this is their 6th week, and they're still at 250 cases. In my state, Victoria, it came in. They went really hard and knocked it off in 2 weeks because the government that's allowing it to run on is saying, there's got to be a compromise between freedoms and the cost. And what they don't understand, and even the national government, which Steve says is a deeply conservative climate denial government and not too good on COVID either, has now said, yes, in future it is the strict lockdowns. Go hard, go early, go strict. They can knock this off, and you get the economy back. And it's a perfect parallel for climate change. I mean, we're saying we can't act on climate change because or cost us too dear, yet we know that at the present time, the actual policy commitments after Paris, where that policy has been turned into some legislative form, not just waving your hand saying we're going to do the right thing, is still consistent with 3 degrees of warming without taking the feedbacks into account. So I think it's fairly widely recognised that the current path with the commitments we've got now is 3 to 4 degrees of warming. And, we know increasingly science is speaking out. 13, 14 years ago, national security experts in the US in a wonderful report called The Age of Consequences said, if you get to 3 degrees of warming, the world is likely to be characterised by the term outright chaos. The World Bank said you can't adapt to 4 degrees. Ramanathan in the States has said 3 degrees is catastrophic. Particularly for the poorest 3 billion people in the world, whose income will decline 75%. So, this sort of no economic cost thing is something that has no timeline on it. Yes, no economic cost now, but no economy in 50 years' time.
Yeah. And that's where, I mean, that's what I've been hammering. Have you seen my work on Nordhaus, David?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm horrified by that. It is not just a case of worrying too much about the costs and of climate change. It's fictionalizing what the damages are.
Oh, look, it is scandalous that he got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Totally. And in fact,
Nobel Economics Prize. I mean, if anybody looks at his work, I mean, he basically didn't take damages into account.
Well,
He just said that they looked at hotter and colder weather, climate over a number of American states over a couple of decades, and then drew out a damages function, which had nothing to do with what climate change will really do. And Steve says, his optimum scenario, his least cost scenario, was 3 degrees of warming.
No, worse, 4.
3 to 4. And in that scenario, emissions are higher. In his optimum scenario, emissions are higher in 2050 than they are now. Yeah. I mean, it is scandalous. And I don't understand. I don't understand the Nobel process, but I mean, it is just notorious.
Well,
let me do something here. I want to set you up, Steve, on this, because we keep re-emphasizing, and I'm not sure if David knows about the submittal that is either happening this coming week or in the next few weeks, to the Royal Society. Steve, why don't you tell them what you've been working on? And
well, yeah, I mean, it's got to get through refereeing, obviously, David. But I was invited after the globalizations paper. Globalizations, you've seen the journal itself. It's obviously not a high-ranking journal, but as it happened, one of the editors is a friend and was seeing my stuff and said, "You want to write something formal about this rather than just the PowerPoint presentations you're giving everywhere?" So I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll write it up." And of course, that got through the referees of globalizations and got fairly enormous exposure on Twitter. If you know the altmetric measure of academic impact,
don't tell me.
I didn't know it either, frankly, until the editor said, "Wow, you've got an altmetric of almost 2,000." And then what that means is, in terms of this is a commercial service that indexes how much public exposure an academic paper gets. And they have 18 million journal articles they've indexed, and mine is the top 3,300th, roughly. So that's the level of exposure, but it didn't get into the mainstream media at all. However, because of it got seen by a review editor at the Proceedings of the Royal Society, and they've invited me to write a paper for scientists now on the economics of climate change as it has been done by neoclassical economists.
Yep.
And we're finishing up. I'm writing it actually with a couple of scientists, a mathematician and 2 other economists, non-orthodox ones, obviously.
Well, you've got plenty to say on that topic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is, the economists have completely undermined the potential program that we could have had if we had just scientists and engineers involved from the outset, because we got our first warning from engineers, and this is what people don't realize, engineers in 1972 from the limits to growth. Yep. That was written by Massachusetts Institute of Technology engineering staff.
And to be honest, engineers in the oil companies knew it at the same time.
That's right. And anyone with a science background who was aware of the impact of global warming from greenhouse gases could do the extrapolations, could work out the rough relationship. So in that sense, we knew from the oil giants in the 60s, and the engineers put it together at a more collective level and said, what is the overall feedback effects of the life system we call Earth of this continued industrial growth and then pollution that goes with it, and converting resources from farmland into industrial and so on. What are the feedbacks? And we're now living that. And of course, the economists were the ones who derailed that. And the specific economists who did the most to derail the critical acceptance of the limits to growth was William Nordhaus. Yeah. This guy's fingerprints are all over it. So he got the Nobel Prize because he protected neoclassical economics from criticism.
Yep.
That's why they award it.
And when I was doing a little bit of work on this last year, I was really taken by a guy called Spencer Glendon, who was a former director of investment research at Wellington Management, who's now at a place called the Woodwell Research Centre, which is a climate and economics research centre in the US. And he said, and I quote unquote, "The economics of climate change will be seen as one of the worst mistakes humans have made, much worse than any of the denialists." And I think that's just fabulous, because I did economics at the ANU in Canberra, and in first year I was taught Keynes's general theory, and by third year we were studying monetarism. So I was right on the switch in 1970.
What year was that, David?
69 to 72.
I was 71 to 73, and by that stage, when I arrived, at Sydney University, they'd kicked out the Keynesian stuff, and we were getting straight neoclassical general equilibrium model. So
sorry, Steve, and in that, I mean, I did so many semesters where all we were taught was cost-benefit analysis. I stopped turning up because it was the same thing over and over again. And I mean, that's one of the things we've got now, this assumption that, and it's in these economic scenarios, the assumption that the future can be quantified, that it can all be probabilistic, because Keynes way back said the future is radically uncertain. We know if we toss a dice or play cards what the probabilities will be, but Keynes said over and over again, for other things we cannot attribute probabilities. They're just guesses. They're not probabilities in the way that a dice or set of cards or a gambling table is. And we shouldn't put numbers on these things because they imply a certainty that doesn't exist.
And the other thing, of course, what has happened since then, Keynes at one stage said, he called what we call neoclassical, he called classical. By the way, I've got to let a cat out. Okay, cat here is.
Well, you let the cat out and I'll keep on talking.
You do, yeah, I'll come back in a moment.
Isn't there some sort of like a truism or a euphemism with that, like who let the cat out of the bag or something like that?
I mean, the thing is that, Keynes said this is radically uncertain. But with the rise of the Chicago school said, yes, a number can be put on everything. And as soon as you can put a number on everything, you can reduce everything to a model, because a model is just numbers being crunched. And the problem with that, of course, is that the models are arbitrary. Models reflect, and here's the social construction you were talking about earlier, models reflect the social beliefs of the modelers. So, for example, the International Energy Agency has come out with a net zero 2050 scenario or model where nuclear power is double by 2050. Now, compared to now. Now, that's just an assumption because I think that's what they want. They also assume that 20% of primary energy will come from bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, even though the technology at scale doesn't exist. So all these models, all these scenarios of the future reflect the modelers' assumptions. I mean, the problem with policymakers is that they think that these models have some scientific credibility, that they're some way organic, rather than just a narrative that somebody has constructed. And that's the problem, that this idea, I mean, I don't know whether you talked about it, but Mervyn King and John Kay wrote a wonderful book about called Radical Uncertainty, which King was the former governor of the Bank of England and was there during the GFC. And he points out that the models couldn't see the GFC coming. Steve could, but I mean, modelers and people who are expert in this area, so supposedly, couldn't see the global financial crisis coming 12 months in advance. So how can you know what the damages are going to be in 30 or 40, 50 years' time? It's an absurd proposition that you can get to 2 decimal points of what growth will be if you have this technology when you can't see the GFC in 12 months. I mean, this is the disconnect.
So let's let Steve answer that. And what my summary point for the audience would be to say, what and this is kind of also, I'd like Steve to comment about this. But what are the first principles? Like what are our axioms that we build this on? Because models are very tenuous.
Well, to me, it isn't just the mathematical modeling. I'm not anti-mathematical, obviously. What is wrong with the mathematics neoclassical is done. They've left out, first of all, they've turned uncertainty into risk.
Yep.
And they've also left out feedbacks. And feedback which are obvious. in the real world. So, in terms of the uncertainty not being risk, Keynes had this wonderful line about the why do we rely so much upon what we know now and project it into the future, even though we know in the past that hasn't worked. He said because the future we simply do not know. And therefore, it makes sense, even though it's wrong, it makes sense to rely upon what we know when there's just nothing we can say about the future. So people tend to extrapolate current beliefs forward. And that's how they cope with uncertainty, even though they generate some of the uncertainty we actually experience. The neoclassicals at the time, Keynes said they ignore this. And he wrote a beautiful line saying, I accuse the classical economic school of being one of those petty, polite techniques suitable to a well-paneled boardroom, which deals with the fact that we don't know it deals with the present by pretending that we don't need to worry about the future. Something of that nature. I've got the final part wrong. What's actually happened since then is that they've replaced it with the belief we can predict the future using what they call rational expectations. And what's rational expectations? It's having a neoclassical model in your head when you live in a neoclassical model. And therefore, if the government tries to do something, you know what the impact is going to be on the model economy in which you live.
It's self-referential.
Yeah, and therefore you cancel out the effect of government policy. Now, they've now said we can predict the future, and they call that rational. So it is not just that they are mathematical. They've made a number of total bastardizations of the real world to fit within a vision of the world that has no dangers to it. And then along comes global warming, and what you see, the reason Nordhaus dived into this area was that the limits to growth study was based on the idea of a whole set of positive and negative feedbacks between components of a global system. And if you got the overall components right, then it didn't really matter if you were out by an order of magnitude in some of your inputs, because the feedbacks are what dominate the system as you push it towards a stress point. And what they did was they took about, I think it's either 7 or 9 fundamental dimensions of the planet. So pollution was one, production is another, food consumption, population, et cetera, about 7 or 9 overall variables. And then they produced index numbers of each of those going back to 1900. And they got the middle to fit from 1900 to 1970. And then they simply ran it forward to 2100.
And said around about now, 2020 to 2030, the S is going to hit the fan.
And they were dead right. So they were even Vaclav Smil, who's a very good researcher in engineering, rubbished them because of the imprecision of their numbers and so on. But what they got right was the feedbacks. They got the fundamental feedback system states in there. And they deliberately, on the horizontal axis of their graphs, they start at 1900, they finish at 2100, and there are no numbers in between. And that was deliberate because they were not making a precise prediction. We're getting overall tendencies. But when you look at it, the model,
it was pretty good.
The shit hits the fan in 2020.
Yeah, Daniel, I think the other thing is that if you think of climate change, I mean, you have the physical climate models and there's uncertainty in that. And then you've got to translate the physical change of climate change onto the social system. So if you go back to the first element, just the physical understanding of the climate system, as you know, we in Australia had horrendous bushfires, wildfires here 18 months ago that just devastated forests. Those fires were more severe than the models predicted at the high emission scenario in 2100. That is, the models had underestimated where the system could go. You've now had these heat dome effects over northwest United States. You've had this incredible flooding and storm damage in Europe. I see that there's a town in Crete overnight had a minimum temperature of 35 degrees, which broke the European record. And what's happening with these heat domes and this flooding is, once again, the climate scientists are quite honest in saying these physical outcomes are far beyond what our models predicted for this time. And that's simply because the models are incomplete. they can't take into, I mean, in part, they seem to have underestimated the effect of warming the Arctic, destabilizing the jet stream around the Arctic and getting this looping hot and cold. But I mean, that's the nature of any model. It's not perfect. It's not God. It's an approximation. So you've got necessary inadequacies in the physical models. And that's a real jolt for climate scientists. I remember in 2014 when Rigno and company first came out with the paper saying the West Antarctic ice sheet has already crossed its tipping point. And we had scientists on tape saying, looking really shocked, saying, "My God, we didn't expect this for 100 years." In fact, the third IPCC report, it said Antarctic will be stable for 1,000 years. So the knowledge changes, and the physical reality runs ahead of the models. That's just the way it is. Then you say, well, given those physical changes, what does that mean socially? Now, everybody knew.
Hold on a sec, David. Let's let let's let Steve. I think he's going to make a comment about the models, and then we'll get into the social change.
The thing about the physical models is they are physical models. Now, the economists don't even have physics in their models at all. I mean, they literally, and this has been something which, again, from David's time and my time at university forward, back when you and I were going through, the hot stuff was computable general equilibrium models. Remember those?
Yes.
Now, as much as I'll criticize the equilibrium side of those computable general models, what they had was an input-output system. So if you're going to produce steel, you need iron ore and you need coal. And
the basis of the 5-year plan.
Fundamentally, yeah. It was Vasily Leontief, a brilliant Russian mathematician and economist, was the one who developed the whole technology. Yeah. And it came out of real-world planning, and then the economists, this is really hot. We can talk about how you get equilibrium prices. Now, the fact that's false. The models don't converge to equilibrium. But nonetheless, that was what they had in their heads at the time. Well, neoclassical economists don't even understand their own, I'm going to use French again, their own fucking history. And they don't even know, most of the modern ones, they even did this stuff. What they had was what they call the Lucas critique in the mid-70s of these large-scale models. And he said, you've got to know the deep parameters, how are people's utility maximizing behavior going to interact with this, that, or the other. And what they've replaced these physical models with are models of a single commodity world most of the time. You produce a widget, and if you put the widget in a factory, it makes more widgets. And if you eat it, it keeps you alive, et cetera, et cetera. And a single commodity model without all those interactions. And so they can set up, and because they're trying to defend their model of capitalism more than anything else, they've got to the point where they literally believe you can produce output using labor and capital. Nothing else. Just put machines and people inside a factory and goods will come out the other side. No energy in, no air, nothing at all.
No air.
Yeah. So therefore they're divorced from the physical reality, where they're trying to tell us what the impact is of changing that physical reality.
So I want to bring up something here. I think it's a very important point, I guess, to pivot, but I'm guessing there may be some difference between all three perspectives. Okay, and so I'm going to frame this with Naomi Klein. Okay, everybody's, I think, in this is familiar with Naomi Klein and the activism that she does. I think her position can be safely characterized as a complete dismantlement of capitalism. Now, I'm hesitant on that, especially after last episode, Steve. I think that I'm not so anti-capitalism as I am anti-finance and Wall Street, anti-bubble. What are your guys' thoughts about this? And then David, I'll let you go first, because the reason why I bring this up is that I think this inevitably distills down to something political. There's something that we're asking our scientists to make ideological or political stances on how we should actually deal with the science, right? Because I think obviously the policymakers are not equipped to connect the dots here.
Well, look, I find that a bit of an esoteric debate, to be quite honest. I mean, the clear problem with policy making, and it's why Nordhaus had the role he did, and it's what we're seeing now with these net zero 2050 scenarios, is that the corporate world wants to pretend that there is a business as usual solution to climate change.
Yeah.
A bit like COVID, that you can solve the problem without disturbing anything. And the fact is that disruption is now inevitable. Either we don't act and the disruption will actually bring human civilization to an end, or you act in a way which has to be disruptive in order to get a really fast change. I mean, that's why 12 years ago we wrote a book saying the wartime mobilisation, where you actually devote all the resources necessary in the economy to do this. And Will Stephan from Australia, who wrote the famous Hothouse Earth paper, is now on the record as saying, yes, it is a climate emergency. What we have to do is make climate change the first priority of economics and politics. Now, that's a thing for the next 5 to 10 years. You're going to do that within a capitalist society. The idea that capitalist society is going to fall over in the next 10 years and we're going to solve the climate problem is, just not realistic. I mean, the problem is that the time is now really short. For those of you who followed Sir David King, the former UK chief scientist, who's got a new group called the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, he says, and I agree with him, he says, the Arctic physically is on the edge of provoking tipping points that will mean this show is all over. He says in the next 5 years, we've got to try and cool the Arctic, because you've got the Arctic sea ice, which is 3/4 gone. You're now having a debate in academic circles, in scientific circles, about whether Greenland has passed its tipping point. Every week, you're seeing more stuff about the fragility of the permafrost. I mean, we've got the Eastern Amazon that's now past its tipping point. I mean, those big nonlinear feedbacks in the physical system, which the models don't account for, and the integrated assessment models don't account for, are now flooding into the system. Mm-hmm. And time is critically short. If we, in the next 5 years, can stop the Arctic disintegrating, we've got a chance. If we don't, the show might be all over. I mean, in fact, when they wrote their Hothouse paper, they said there is a risk that it's already too late. And we have to accept that. If we don't, we're being naive. So what do we have to do? We have to throw everything at this. That means that it's not business as usual, that you do need the state to take in a role in directing the resources where it needs to solve this. Now, that to me, I know it's a difficult analogy, but that's the wartime model. I mean, when the US government called in Ford and General Motors and said, we've got news for you, you've just made the last civilian car for the next 5 years. Here's what you're making from now on. That was true, and it's true now. I mean, unless we say there is no sustainability as usual solution. Yeah. There's only throwing everything we have at that, and that means a leading role for the state. Does it mean overthrowing capitalism? No, because we don't have another model that's going to work anyway.
Okay, yeah. I agree with the wartime. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Steve, how would you set that up?
The same thing. I mean, not only is it a wartime effort, one part of what went with the wartime effort was consumption rationing back at home.
Yep. And forced savings.
Forced savings, yeah. And we're going to see the same. So we could have had a capitalist path out of this if we'd followed the limits to growth in 1972. There would have been some elements which would have been compulsory. So, for example, population control was part of it. Not letting income inequality get too high was another part. There were definitely limitations on personal freedom as part of it. But generally speaking, you would still have a recognizably capitalist system where the decisions were made within the constraints set by what we knew we could impose on the ecology. You would still have a fundamentally capitalist driving system. Now, no way. I mean, this is... we'll be as capitalist as America was in the Second World War, as Britain was in the Second World War, as Germany was for that matter. It's going to be a command system where you be directed by force to do what is hopefully necessary to avoid complete social collapse. Yep. And you will have corporations doing it. I mean, I'll use the Nazi example. I've been to the factory that made the gas chambers in Germany. So, private enterprise was alive and well, thanks very much. And private enterprise will be alive during our battle against the damages of climate change, but it will be directed by government spending and government fiat. And so, yeah, it's going to be it'll be a war economy. That's easily the best way to think about it. And if we don't win the war, then we don't have civilization on the other side either.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to appreciate is during the war, American corporations, for example, didn't do too badly because they had guaranteed rates of return. That was, you make this at cost plus markup. A tank is what your costs are plus 5 or 10%. So it actually, I mean, we know that the war, set up the base for a huge post-war economic boom. I mean, in places like the United States and Australia, between 35 and 40% of GDP was devoted to the war effort in the key years, 42 to 44. It was more than a third of the economy. I mean, we can't even talk about 5% of the economy being devoted to a decarbonisation effort now. I mean, it really was everything on board. In Germany, towards the end of the war, it was 70% of the economy was directly devoted to the war effort. So, we know these things can be done. It's just that the policy-making process, and it's aided and abetted by the IPCC and these conferences we're going to see in Glasgow, where the whole thing is framed, and these net zero 2050 scenarios are framed. We can do this without any disruption, and until you break that nexus, we'll fail. We should embrace disruption. It is now necessary for our survival.
Yeah, I do the analogy of a world war for the reason that it is a world war because we need every nation in the world to have buy-in to this, to have a unified direction, right? I mean,
I'm actually critical of that because that's one of the ways it's been delayed. And if you want to get global agreement, you're never going to do anything until it's all over. So I think we need policies that work at the nation state level. And the trouble is, again, that it's not just our politicians we can blame for that, it's human nature as well. We're very comfortable, thanks very much. We don't want to change the direction we're on. And all these problems are somebody else's problem. When they hit home, and that's what's happening with the wildfires in America right now, the floods on the other side of the continent, when these disruptions hit, they're going to be so drastic that they make people realize, oh my God, this is survival. And then in that situation, you could do stuff at the national level. So, for example, Germany, after the floods recently, maybe there'll be a change in the attitude in Germany, and they'll realize if we don't do something, we're not going to have a civilization. It'll probably take 2 or 3 more years of events like that before that sinks in. But you need that sort of buy-in before the types of changes we're talking about are going to be politically feasible.
There certainly seemed to be a sort of sense from a distance, a sense of shock amongst the German political leadership after the floods. It was, oh my God, we hadn't seen this coming. And I agree with Steve. I mean, to be honest, I think all these multilateral things should be scrapped because they're simply not working. I mean, abstractly, a deal between 2 countries, the United States and China, would do more to move the climate agenda along than 25 years worth of talks would. And I think, I mean, if the EU is serious about putting carbon taxes on its borders, that will change the debate more than anything that these international policy making processes have, because people either pay the taxes or don't trade.
So I think we've got to work from the nation state up, and the nation state is the only effective political system we have. Our international ones have always been ineffective. And to some extent, this is a classic delaying tactic. Let's make an international agreement about this means let's not do anything.
Yeah, Daniel, I think, I mean, the problem, whether it's the IPCC on the science or whether it's the UNFCCC and the conferences of the parties, they both have the process of tyranny of the minority. For example, with the first part of the next IPCC report, volume 1, I think is being released next week. And we think, yes, scientists write these reports, which they do in a sense, but they're constrained. And John Schellenhuber has pointed out it really depends on who you appoint to be the editors as to what sort of report you get. But once the scientists have written this huge report of 1,000, 2,000 pages, then you gather the diplomats. Diplomats from 190 countries around the world, and they vote sentence by sentence on what's called the summary for policymakers. So the Saudis or the Russians can just cross out. One country can cross out half the sentences in the summary for policymaker, and there's no comeback.
Yeah, Michael Mann talked about the Saudis on that, I think in a referendum on the IPCC report, and it just dismantles the whole effort. So okay, I agree. Okay,
so you get this this. I mean, you could have a non-consensus model of multilateralism, which would produce better results, in my opinion. But what you've got is the lowest common denominator outcome at the moment.
Okay, so then my issue, then my response is the stark reality of the tyranny of the majority and the nations looking at each other going, well, you go first. Well, you go first. You're like, nobody. There's a lack of leadership because of election cycles.
Well, yes, of course, but I mean, I don't think that in the end this question is going to be resolved by governments. I don't think real power in society lives at the level of the state. It lives in the corporate world. I mean, look, honestly, I had a look at my country, Australia, and if you look at the big decisions that have been made over the last 30 years by governments of either side, I can't see any major decision that was made where the corporate elite were opposed to it. That's just the way it is.
David, I mean, this is really fascinating.
The same in the United States. If the penny actually dropped in the corporate elite, that their grandkids are going to burn in hell, the political process would change really quickly. The political process, we live in capitalist states. I mean, the state apparatus, in the first instance, represents the interest of capital. Yeah. And so I, in a way, I don't expect the politicians to lead.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a Winston Churchill on this, and that's you can have the politicians who raise the alarm regardless of what's being said around them, and then they're proven right and they can take over when the crisis hits. We don't have that this time around with climate change. We've got Al Gore, who didn't make it, and there's nobody who's being strident at that level, and if they were, they'd only survive as an opposition person. They wouldn't survive in government. They'd lose an election if they push this forward. And I really, unfortunately, looking at the political process around the world, I don't really know many politicians who've got the sense of urgency David and I have. So the worry is it's all going to be done in a chaotic, what the hell's going on? What can we do? Panic.
Yeah.
And
there'll be a series of events, some things that will happen that will be so dramatic, will be so disturbing that the status quo will just get shattered.
Yeah,
I mean, I wish it had happened before now.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah, the sooner the better. I mean, like I hate to say it, but I want to. If one of those fires took out a major American city, then you think, holy shit, this is what we're talking about. I said, that's just the warm-up, guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember before the American invasion of Iraq in end of 2002, a survey was done in the United States, and they asked people whether they would support this coming war depending on the number of casualties. And in advance of the war, the pollsters said, if 5,000 soldiers, American soldiers, lose their lives, the majority support for the war will become minority. That was the prediction. And that's exactly what happened. This was the calculus, to be really brutal about it. If 5,000 people die, Bush will have lost majority support. And that is exactly the way it played out. At the point when they got to those numbers, the game was over politically. And unfortunately, it feels, I mean, people in the third world dying doesn't matter. Because, we've got millions of people suffering. Look at Syria. I mean, a civil war prompted by climate change as much as anything else. A population of 17 million people, 11 million of them displaced internally or externally. Half them into Europe, which has led to, in some ways, to the rise of right-wing governments and perhaps prompted Brexit. So these are enormous consequences. But because it's Syria, it doesn't matter. If 11 million people were pushed into forced displacement in Germany or France or England or the northeast US, it'd be a different story, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and you need that. It has to hit home at that level. That's like as much as I was amazed by the fires in Canada and the crazy, what was it, 49.6 degrees Celsius?
Yeah,
record. It was good that it was Canada because people paid attention. If it had been India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, oh yeah, that happens all the time. worry? It's going to take a serious shock for people to realise just how critical this is. And even so, we haven't yet got there on a scale of shock which is going to change the politics.
Yeah,
we will.
I think just to come back to COVID for a moment, I mean, despite the different responses around the world, we have seen in the developed nations that all governments have been prepared to go into a non-business as usual mode over the last 18 months.
Yeah.
They realised that the threat was so overwhelming and they couldn't carry their population, with huge numbers of people dying. Maybe Trump was a bit of an exception, but everywhere else, I mean, in Europe and elsewhere, there were severe lockdowns that had an economic price because people considered they were necessary. So we do have a model over the last 18 months of saying there is something more than, every month growth's got to be better than the month before. And in fact, during the Second World War, when surveys were done about what was a certain amount of material scarcity, particularly rationing, for savings schemes, the data in the UK and the US to some extent showed that people supported these really severe measures because they thought they were fair and necessary. And I think that's really interesting too. Not only were they necessary, but rationing was fair. I mean, somebody at the top end of town got 1 pound of butter, the same as a person in public housing, and I think that's
fairness is essential.
Yeah, that's the thing with climate as well. You've got to demonstrate that the actions will be tough, as they were with COVID, but they were fair and necessary, and that's the conversation we haven't had at all.
Right. Okay, so as we approach the last 10 minutes of today's show, I want to keep it all tight for everybody. We're running on the top of the hour here. I'm thinking of a book by David Wallace-Wells, and I'd like you guys to comment on that. And the reason why I bring it up towards the end of this show is that what he actually points out in that book is that the level of catastrophe, and we'll use the example of deaths in this point, in comparison to the horrors done by the Nazi Party, is going to be an order of magnitude more. And that's what we have on our conscience. Is this, do you guys both feel, I don't know if you guys are both familiar with his book, but is this something that you guys feel is, I think I know the answer, but let's do some prediction.
Look, I think there's some really valuable lessons to be learned from public health promotion or marketing. We know when you have a really severe health issue, whether it be AIDS or a pandemic or something else, health authorities have learned this model really well. You've got to be really, think about the response to AIDS. You've got to be really honest about the problem, because if you're not honest, you won't get it. Secondly, you've got to have a solution, and then you've got to have what's called an efficacious path from problem to answer. Yes, it is really bad. Here's what we need to do, and yes, we can do it. I mean, that's what happened in AIDS in this country. We had a very successful campaign. To some extent, it's what happened in pandemic. Nobody has really underplayed the scientific reality, and it said people have been really honest about what will happen if you let it rip. And governments didn't let it rip. So I think David Wallace-Wells is absolutely right in saying this is what it's going to look like. If you don't incorporate into your soul the harsh reality of the end of civilization, you don't get it. And from there, you can be motivated to act. But if you want a bright side and say it's not so bad and be like George Bush and sit on an aircraft carrier in May 2003 saying mission accomplished in Iraq, when 20 years later they live with their tails between their legs, yes, absolutely, you've got to call it out, and then you've got to call out what's necessary. And that's where we've got the problem now, because this is an emergency that does really require that national and international mobilisation of resources beyond business as usual, and that's where we're stuck. So we are getting the problem, but we can't talk about the solution yet.
Yeah. I've read a part of that book. I actually prefer Mark Linus's 6 Degrees. I think that does a better job of saying, looking at paleontological research, what sort of planet will we have at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 degrees above pre-industrial? And that I find more effective than David Wallace-Wells's work. But overall, what you're looking at is you can't sustain a civilization with a temperature rise that is going to cause those tipping points to hit, because you get a climate which is so volatile, nothing that we build which is reliant upon permanence is going to work. So like I'm in that particular village in Germany where there was a sinkhole that just wiped out, an entire half the village and a fair bit of the agricultural land around it. That's what you've got to expect, not heavy rains, but rains that wash away a village or a town. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, with the Nazis, the reference with 6 million, if you say an order of magnitude, that's 60, I think you've got to allow 2 or 3 more magnitudes as feasible. And then, and that's the sort of framework that I have, that something of that scale. Now, if that happens, then nothing resembling human civilization is going to persist. So you have to say, well, what can we do to stop it? And one of the things I've been working on, I've never have enough time to do it, but is the idea of bringing in carbon rationing using the fairness that David spoke about a moment ago, where we bring in a parallel currency. Everybody gets an account at the central bank. The central bank distributes universal carbon credits to everybody, the same carbon credit to me as they would give to, say, Jamie Packer. And there's an Australian, a wealthy Australian that Australians are aware of. I think Donald Trump with less style, and therefore I would, if the ration was the average for the country, then 95% of the population would still have their ration left over, but the top 5% would exhaust it in half an hour each day and have to buy carbon rations off the poor, and then you would have a distribution system from the rich to the poor as part of your rationing. And the major reason for doing that is agreeing totally with David's point. If this is seen as unfair, nothing is going to work, nothing will hold us together. We have to impose the rationing and the cutback in our consumption fairly across everybody. And then we have to devote as much as we can of our resources to things like reseeding the Arctic with ice, so we stop the runaway processes, or try to stop them before, again, if we do them too late, forget about it. If we've triggered the complete disappearance of the Arctic summer sea ice, which we probably have, then unless we reverse that now, the Greenland's going to go. And once Greenland starts to go, it's argument over. And the weather patterns of the entire planet will change, and all the physical structures we've built our economy on top of will be in the wrong place or destroyed. So that's the way we have to think about it, and there's no way where that is being thought about that way at the high political levels or in business circles, as David mentioned earlier.
David, what are your comments about a global currency, a carbon currency? Do you think that this is something that's possible?
Look, I think what Stephen's talking about, which is basically carbon rationing, which you have a right to so much emissions, and you have to wind it down quite quickly. I mean, George Monbiot in I think 2007 wrote a book about this, a whole book about carbon rationing, and I did a little bit of work on it. And there were a few carbon rationing groups actually set up in Melbourne, where people tracked their emissions and brought them down. It's absolutely necessary. I mean, the reality behind it, as Steve says, is that 10% of the world's population is responsible for 50% of the emissions. And if you got that 10% of people and reduce their emissions even back to the EU average, so they're not without emissions, they're just, doing what an average person in the EU does. If that 10% reduce their emissions back to the EU average, suddenly a third of the world's emissions is gone. You've got a 1/3 reduction in global emissions overnight by the rich 10% just behaving like the rest of us in terms of their emissions. And that's a bit we don't want to talk about.
Yeah, we're going to have to talk about it.
Is it okay? I'm going to be a little bit, ignorant here, and I'm coming from a layman perspective on this. But how closely is that coupled to a corporate emission? Like, how does the line between corporate and individual blur? Because I don't know if this is.
Well, when a very rich individual jumps first class or business class on Etihad, it's both, isn't it? It's corporate,
and it's also the corporate jets.
And the corporate jets. This is the interface that elite consumption is driven by a particular set of companies who engage in elite production.
You've also got, there's been parts of a manufacturing system that can't survive without carbon, right? Like, you can't make concrete right now without carbon inputs.
Getting close.
Getting closer. We're going to get there. Steel, the same thing. We're getting closer. But what that means is, of your current production capacity, how much can be allowed to operate with current technology? The answer comes down to maybe 5 or 10%. And then you can actually replace the 90 to 95%, but it's going to take you 10, 20 years to do it. So you've got to see a dramatic drop in aggregate consumption levels, but that has to be imposed on the wealthy, not the poor. Yeah. Otherwise, we won't have a society left.
Yep. Guys, that's a perfect summary. Are you guys okay with that? That's right on the hour. That brings us where we need to be. David? Okay.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Steve.
Good to talk, David. Yeah.
Cheers.
Say hi to some of my friends in Melbourne. Okay, bye.
Bye.